Maybe later, when falling asleep.
So let's go ahead and get started. And then we'll hopefully be done a little earlier tonight. I can't promise anything.
Is this the end of?
This is the end of 1 Samuel. Yeah.
Oh, is it?
Yep.
Lord, again, we're thankful for all that you've done for us. Thankful for your word that you've given us as a light unto our feet. And Lord, I pray that you will anoint your word as it goes out tonight. Anoint my lips to say those things you'd have me to say, and anoint our hearts to receive. And we just thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. If I can stay awake, we'll be in good shape.
Okay.
This treatment is just knocking me out.
What is?
The treatments I'm taking, this radiation treatment. Man, it just knocks me out.
Why are you taking radiation?
Oh, I had some cancer cells they found, so they're getting rid of them.
My sister said that too about radiation.
All right, so we're going to start 1 Samuel chapter 30, beginning with verse 1. Now it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had invaded the south, and Ziklag attacked. Ziklag, the south and Ziklag, attacked Ziklag and burned it with fire, and had taken captive the women and those who were there, from small to great. They did not kill anyone, but carried them away and went their way. So David and his men came to the city, and there it was, burned with fire, and their wives, their sons, and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept, until they had no more power to weep. And David's two wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite, had been taken captive. Now David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. All right, you remember last week, David was with Achish in the army of the Philistines, and he was they were preparing to go to war with Israel. And the other lords of the Philistines said, "We don't want David, send him home." And so we ended last week with David being sent home in this part of the history of the story of it. And so now we pick that part up. And what we find is that after they were ordered to leave the Philistine encampment, David took his 600 men and he went back to Ziklag. Remember, Ziklag was the city that was given to him by Achish, the Philistine king. And this was his city. And so they went on back home. Now, we don't know how long David had been away from Ziklag. We do know it took 3 days to get back, so you can assume it took 3 days to get there, where the army was assembled. So if it took 6 days on the road to Aphek, where the army was assembling, so that's a week basically, and we don't know how long he was in the court of Achish before. I'm sure Achish had to get his army together and get everybody situated before they took off to go up to Aphek. So we don't know how long it was. It could have been 1, 2, 3 months. Kings and bring them all together, plus anybody else that was joining in the conflict, any of their guys. And so they could have been gone for a month or 2 or 3. We don't know. But we do know it took 3 days to get back. And if you know human nature, when you're getting home and you've been gone a while, you tend to move a lot faster than when you leave. And the journey was miles roughly, give or take, someplace right in there. So it took them 3 good, hard walking, because they didn't ride in those days. They didn't have their Sherman tanks yet. They were on order, but they hadn't come in yet. And their troop transports, and they didn't have horses and camels. So the only thing they would have would be oxen and donkeys.
Donkeys.
Yeah, the good old donkeys. And they don't move very fast. So, you can figure they probably made who knows how many miles an hour they actually covered the ground with. However, being soldiers and being the amount of time they had to stop was probably very little. If you have women and children, it's going to take a lot longer. You're going to make maybe a mile an hour overall over any extended period of time with women and children. But with just men, and they're all fit soldiers, they were moving probably pretty good. And they come back, and you can kind of see, they come over the hill where they can first get a glimpse of the city of Ziklag. Now remember, Ziklag was in the Judean hills in the southern part, where it wasn't as tall, but they were still little hills and stuff. So the first time they get a look at Ziklag, what they find is still smoke rising from the embers of what used to be their town. Can you imagine what went through their minds? Especially when you remember it was David and his men who was doing the same thing to the Amalekites and to all the rest of the nomad tribes that were coming through and raiding, Israel. They went out and burned their stuff down and killed them all off and all of that. And here they come over the hill, and here's their city
On fire.
On fire. We think sometimes we go through trials, and sometimes we have things happen, that are catastrophic in our lives. But here's 600 loyal soldiers, David, next king of Israel, and his city has been destroyed, been burned. All the goods that were in it were stolen. All the inhabitants, they've been captive. They're gone. What happened to them? The first thing had to go through their minds. Where's my wife? Where's my kids? What's happened to them? And you remember these Amalekites were nomads. And of course the nomadic people, they had their own country, which was in what is now Jordan, on the other side of the Jordan River, back in the desert areas there, in Sinai, which is now Saudi Arabia and Jordan. That was really their territory, their homeland. And so for a good part of the year, they were there. They set their camps up, and they had more, it wasn't walled city type things, but they had their permanent encampments there. And then they would leave, and then they would make the circuit through, one way or the other, through Canaan. And they would raid, they would take whatever they could, bring it all home. And so this was a nomadic life. And of course they led their sheep and goats and whatever else, and oxen, looking for pasture land as they went. And so this was the life they lived. But the downside of that is what happened to all the people. Because they wouldn't kill the people. What they would do is either sell them for a profit, or they would turn them into slaves. You remember the story of Joseph. He was sold in slavery in Egypt. It was the nomads that came through that took him and sold him. Joseph's brothers sold him to these slave traders, is what they were, and they took him on down to Egypt. And this was the same thing that the Amalekites were doing. They would sell them off, or they would use them. So there was no way of knowing what was going on. But the Amalekites also had spies. These nomads, as they would move through the land, they would either leave people there as spies, or they would employ people to be spies for them. So they were probably very well aware that the majority of the Philistine army was up in Aphek, up 80 miles away, and David and his men were 80 miles away. Now's the opportunity. David had been raiding and burning and killing all their brethren off. Now was the chance to get back at David. You notice the only town that was burned was Ziklag, that we're told. Now they raided other places. It talks about how the other places were taken, and raided, but nothing was burned except Ziklag. So this kind of indicates that there was a bit of revenge there, and they had timed it just perfectly. Without David and his men, the whole southern region was defenseless. They had nobody to protect them. You remember, even before David went to King Achish, you remember there was a time when he was in that same area, and he protected all the shepherds that were there. And you remember he went to Nabal and says, we protected all your sheep this whole season. Now we need some animals to sacrifice and for a feast. And Nabal turned him down, and that's how he got Abigail to be his wife, because God killed Nabal. That was the end of him. Yeah. And so David was well known down there, and it was probably this same band of Amalekites that David ran off all the time, wouldn't let them go up in there and take whatever they wanted. So they found the opportunity. Notice also that all the inhabitants of the land were taken. Nobody was killed. Now, Achinoam, I got it later, I got it down here. It's Achinoam. That was the wife of Saul. You remember when Saul took Michal, who was given to David, and who was David's wife, and gave it to another man, David went and took Saul's wife, Achinoam. And she was the Jezreelite, from Jezreel. And that was 3 or 4 lessons ago. And Abigail, who was the wife of Nabal. And David married her after Nabal was killed by God. And so there was his 2 wives. But they were all alive, all the families, all the people were alive, and apparently unharmed by the Amalekites. Now this in itself is interesting, because usually the older people, like me, they wouldn't keep him around. And we know David's family was with him. That would be his father, mother. They were probably up there in years. And I'm sure there were other older folks there. Well, they wouldn't have put up with them because they'd be too slow. And so they'd just kill them off. They'd show no regard for anybody, these nomads. And we're going to see a little later on how they even regarded their own servants. They just didn't have it. Why did they keep these people alive? I mean, you could see keeping the kids, or the women and the able-bodied men, because it would bring money. But what about the old people?
It was God.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. And what about you?
We look at this and we say, this is a terrible thing. But the thing to remember here is David was operating outside the perfect will of God. He decided to go to Gath. He decided to go down there and move to Ziklag. This was all David's idea, David's decisions. And we don't see at any point that he ever consulted God about any of these moves. He just did them. In fact, the prophet specifically told him, stay in Judah. Stay there in Judah, right there, where I put you. And he didn't do it.
Right.
Now this tells us something. We can go off on our own, and we can go against the perfect will of God. But things don't always work out the way we want them to work out. However, God, in His mercy, will still keep His hand of protection on us. He will still be there to oversee things. He's still in control of everything. But I think the key here is that while David failed in some specific points, he still had a heart that was longing for God, that was wanting to follow God, that was wanting to be what God wanted him to be. That's why he was a man with a heart after God's own heart. It wasn't just his mercy. It wasn't just, I pointed a few things out about him, He was the one that always wanted to take on the blame instead of putting it on somebody else, even when it wasn't his. It's my fault, even if it wasn't his fault. He had all of these attributes. And once in a while he would fail. But that was okay. It was okay because God still blessed him. God still led him. And sometimes the blessings are very well disguised. When we look at this situation, I'm sure David down those 600 men and said, "Oh, look, God is blessing us. Our town is burned up and everybody's gone." Right?
Yeah.
But in the end, it turned out to be a blessing. And we'll talk about that. All right. So when they saw everybody was gone, they all started weeping. And they all started mourning. And they cried until they couldn't cry anymore. I don't know if you've ever been in that position where you cry until nothing else comes out. And it's just kind of sobbing and nothing's happening. I mean, I can see these big, strong guys out there, you know, with their armor and their swords, and they're going on and on about it. And you can't blame them, because they didn't know what had happened to their families, and they knew what these nomads were capable of doing. They cried, they wept. And the men of David were so grieved that they started discussing among themselves if they shouldn't stone David. Now, we're going to see something about these 600 men of David. You know, we've often probably, you know, from the time I was a little kid, I remember David and his 600 mighty men. You always hear about his 600 mighty men. And so we build this picture of men who were so dedicated to David and to God, you know, that they were mighty men in every possible way. But we're going to find out that isn't at all the case. They were 600 mighty men, yes. They could stand out in the field and kill 1,000 soldiers by themselves. They could do all of these things. But they were ordinary people with the same problems, with the same responses to difficulties that we have. And yet we somehow think as Christians that if we're a mighty man or woman of God, we're above all of that. We'll never succumb to any problem. We're always, God, you've got control. Saying, no matter what comes your way, God will take care of you. And that's all true. But what we don't say is, in spite of what you might feel, in spite of what you might even do, God will take care of you. And here 600 men have been following David now for several years. They have seen the mighty acts of God. They've heard about Goliath. They heard about the lion. They heard about the bear. They have all of those stories. They have seen God miraculously deliver large armies into their hands, slaughtering all of them, and nobody even gets hurt. And yet along comes this situation. Well, let's stone David. He should never have taken us. He should never have made an alliance with Achish. He should never have come to Ziklag. He should never have gone back with the other army. He should never have, he should have.
Maybe you shouldn't have followed him.
Isn't that men and women today?
Yeah.
Things don't go right, and the first thing they want to blame is who? The leader.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I'm here to tell you, you take a people, a group of people who are united, and a group of people, Christians, who want to see something done, who do what the Bible says, it doesn't matter what the leader does.
As long as they're faithful and they do.
That's right. That's why I said where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I'm in the midst of them. He didn't say where 2 or 3 and the leader, or where the leader is. See? We want to put everything on whoever the leader is.
Right.
Oh, the country's in the position it is because we have this leader, or we have this governor, and that's the problem, or this mayor, and that's the problem. Now, that doesn't mean those guys shouldn't have blame put on them, maybe. But the way to fix it is to what? Pray for them. What would happen if we just said, we're going to have a special night, we're not going to do anything except meet here and pray for the governor? Well, I can tell you what would happen. First of all, nobody would show up.
Are you sure?
Huh?
Are you sure?
Well, maybe, but I mean, if we had that, and people were really understanding how the Word works and how God works, if we got even a small band of people that would get together and do nothing but pray for our leaders, I wonder what kind of a change it'd make. We get into this where, if we could just get Franklin Graham to call a special thing, or we could just get, I forget who it was, called that a few years ago, called a big assembly and worship, and everybody went there to pray. I don't know if you remember that. It was televised. There was, 1.5 million people or so, or 2 million showed up on the Washington Mall, and he had them all down on their knees and says, we're going to repent. You remember that? So they did it. And what happened after that? Nothing. Because it didn't continue to go on. It would have been fine. It probably would have changed the course of our nation if it had been consistent. Consistent.
Well, last Wednesday was, Graham had asked for a prayer for the president.
Yes. And I applaud that. That's
I
great.
did too,
It's great.
yeah.
But we don't need 1 million people praying. We need 2 or 3. My point is, it's great if we could get 1 million. That's let's see, that's what? 500, that's quite a bit, But if we just had 2 or 3 that were earnest, that prayed with passion, because the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man. Fervent means with passion, that we really were concerned, and it was a consistent thing. What would happen? Would we not get the same results as if we had 1 million? Does God move because of numbers?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Not according to my book, he doesn't. There was only 120 in the upper room, and they won 3,000 in one day.
Yeah.
Numbers don't matter to God. Faithfulness does. Let's move on, or my wife will be after me here. All right. Notice the last thing here. People's souls were grieved, and their sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord,
It's God.
his God. Now this is very significant. It just got through saying David was with them crying just as hard as they were. He cried and wept until he couldn't cry and weep anymore. Same position they were in. But then he did something. It doesn't mean that because he was the leader, everybody was crying and everybody was upset, and David was standing over here saying, God, I'm going to strengthen myself in you. No. He cried and wept just like they did. And when he had got to the point where he couldn't cry anymore, then he strengthened himself. You can't strengthen until you're weak. You can only, if you're already strong, you're not going to strengthen.
Right.
It's only when you're in the weak places that you strengthen yourself. We miss that, We want to be strong in the Lord. We want to be strong and go through every temptation, every trial, and just breeze through it. But we can't allow God to strengthen us unless we're at the bottom of the trial, where we need the strength. And he didn't have the high priest with him. He didn't have Samuel with him. He didn't have anything except himself and his faith in God. And notice what this says. I saw this today, and it just really clicked with me. He encouraged himself in Jehovah, the existing one. He strengthened himself in the existing one. What was the significance of that? It meant that God was not back there or over there or anywhere else. He was existing right there. So he knew what was going on. Didn't matter when, where, or how, but God knew what was going on. He was Jehovah, the existing one. Now, it would have been great if he just stopped there. He didn't stop there. And I may be speaking on this Sunday. This really hit me hard today. I may try to develop it. I'm speaking Sunday, so you guys all have a warning. Take note of those or something. Anyway, he encouraged himself in Jehovah, the existing one, his Elohim, his Lord. The word Elohim, as I've mentioned before, does not necessarily just mean God. It can be any divine personage or anything that is considered divine. Angels are called Elohims.
How do you spell that?
Yes. In the Psalms, in fact, God says to them,
Spell it.
oh, spell it? I'm sorry. I thought you said you never heard that. Well, it's spelled Elohim, Elohim.
Thank you.
It's not pronounced exactly the way it's spelled. But it can mean angels. In Psalms, God is talking to the angels, and he says, you guys, you're all going to die like men. You, Elohim, are going to die like men. Why? Because you didn't do what I told you to do. And if you read that in context, it's talking about the angels who were given specific duties and they didn't fulfill those duties. They didn't look after the people they were supposed to look at them. And God is saying, you're going to die like men because you didn't do what I told you. Elohim. So to David, but Elohim also means little g God. The people of that day had their own gods. They had an idol they would put in their house. That was their Elohim, or their personal God. It was the personal God that they saw every day. It was the personal God that they prayed to every day. It was what they put their strength in. When the crops started to come in, they had Elohim, their idol that took care of the crops. And they had this fixation that said, this is the one who takes care of that for me. Now, I'm not saying we have idols, but to David, it wasn't just Yahweh, it wasn't just Jehovah, great existing God, but to David, this existing God that was to the heathen. I guess some of you weren't in some other classes, but most of the heathens of those days, the pagans, even in India today, when you look at the Indian religions, the Hindu, the Sikh, and all they all have one thing in common, as did all of the idol worshippers in Canaan. They all had their own individual idols, whether it was Dagon or whether it was Ashtaroth or whether it was the little idol they had in their house that they gave a name to. They all agreed with one thing. There was one overshadowing God. And it was the God you couldn't talk to. You had to get this God here carried really all the power, but you had to go through these other gods, and they would go to this God with all the power. Now we see that especially in Hindus, because they have all of these names for all of these gods that they have. But when you really look at it, and you go into their literature and all they believe in this one overarching deity. They don't even give it a name. It's just this universe and cosmos thing. And what they're describing is a spirit that is over all of these, but you can't get there unless you go through one of these other gods. All of them had that same concept. That's why when you remember Nebuchadnezzar threw the three Hebrew children in the fire. And he walked around and he said, I see four, and it looks like the Son of God.
Right.
What he was saying, it looks like one of the gods, the sons of God, is in there with them. And then he said there is, he finally admitted, he says, there's no other God like your God. Because this was the God they couldn't reach. And the reason he held Daniel and the three Hebrew children in such high esteem is that they could reach this God. Didn't believe, it didn't mean he was converted. He still believed in his own gods. But there was this one big God up here. And even the Hebrews, that's why it was so easy for them to fall into idolatry. Because even though they may have been worshiping Baal or Ashtaroth, they still held Jehovah as being this overarching God.
They didn't really worship him.
What's that?
But they really didn't worship him.
Well, again, what happened is, and remember, in those days, you didn't worship God. You brought your sacrifices, and the high priest burned the sacrifices. And worship, they didn't have a temple yet. So, in the tabernacle, they didn't have David and his psalms and all of that. So there really wasn't worship services as such. It was just bringing sacrifices. And, well, they looked around at the other nations, and what were they doing? Taking sacrifices to Ashtaroth, to Baal, and whatever, doing basically some of the same things Israel was doing, only they understood that their God, Baal, was only over this part, and that he answered to a higher God. So all they did is said, well, if we're in this part of the world, then we'll do the same thing. We'll worship, we'll give our sacrifices and stuff to Baal, and Baal will go to Jehovah. The problem is, they don't know that this overarching God is Jehovah. Reasoning. So, David, by his statement here, is saying, I'm not with these other groups. I don't need Baal or Ashtaroth. I don't need another God to worship. I don't need another God to follow.
So David knew better.
What's that?
David knew better than,
David knew better,
I
yes.
think a lot of people knew better.
Yes, but he made a statement here in front of everybody. Really. He was saying, and I believe it's here, because David made the statement. And that would go right in hand with David. He would have said to his men, listen, I know we're at the bottom of the barrel, but I am going to strengthen myself in Jehovah, who is my Elohim. He is my personal God. He's not just a God or the God over every other God. He is my God. He personalized God. And this was important that it happened here. Because this was the moment, I think, this was the moment when David determined that he was no longer going to be David the hero. He was going to be David the follower of Elohim, his God. Now, so what happened? So David said to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, please bring the ephod here to me. And Abiathar brought the ephod to David. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered him, pursue, for you shall surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. So David went, he and his 600 men who were with him, and came to the brook Besor. where those stayed who were left behind. But David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 stayed behind, who were so weary that they could not cross the brook Besor. Now here's the difference. Instead of David saying to his men, hey men, come on, get your swords sharpened, we're going after them right now. They got a head start on us, we got to catch them. That would have been the David of Gath. That would have been the David, of Ziklag. Action, let's go, it's time to go. Let's move. But he stopped. And he called for the high priest. And he said to the high priest, put on the ephod. I'm reading between the lines there how the ephod works. Put on the ephod. High priest came with the ephod on. David said, God, do you want me to go after these Amalekites? Do you want me to catch them? And the high priest took out the Urim and the Thummim. And I don't know, we still don't know how it worked. Probably, at least in this case, the prophet became, the priest became the mouthpiece of God. And he said to David, you go after him. Because you're going to take back everything that's been taken from you. You see, David didn't just go charging off. He had learned his lesson. And he realized that God, if God was going to be, if Jehovah was going to be his personal God, then he needed to consult with his personal God before he went off into battle. Instead of just assuming that God, overarching God, was going to take care of him no matter what he did, because he's always done that. But in this case, he learned his lesson. And so they took off. And thing is here, that God had developed a trust based on what God said and what God had already done. Sometimes we lack faith because we've never allowed God to really do anything for us. Sounds strange, doesn't it? God, I need bills paid.
That's true.
God, I need these bills paid. I don't know what to do. I know. You pick up the phone. Hey, I've got, how much do I owe on my house? How much balance do can I get a homeowner's loan? Huh? God, I can't pay this, but I know I can get a homeowner's loan. Do we do that? We ask God to do it, and then we, in a hurry, in our own ways, charge off to do it. Why do we do that? Because God is Jehovah. God is the overarching God that takes care of us.
Because we can't wait.
Yeah. We need to bring it down to saying that God is my God, just as those who had the little idols in their homes would get up and pray to their little God every morning, God, I need you to send rain. We criticize them for that. We say, oh, that idol worship, prayers weren't going anywhere, and that's all very true. But the concept that they had is that I must rely upon my Elohim.
Yeah.
David put his faith in God. God, do I go after him? Yeah. And you're going to defeat him. Because I'm going to help you. I'm going to be right there with you. All right. If you want to know how the Urim worked, Numbers 27 and 21. It says this. This is when Moses was talking to God about Joshua. And he wanted to know what to do with Joshua. And listen to this. 27:21. And, this is God speaking, and he shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall ask a counsel of him after the judgment of Urim before the Lord, Jehovah. At his word shall they go out, and at his word shall they come in, both he and all the children of Israel with him, even all the congregation. In other words, God was telling Moses, Joshua shall stand before the high priest, and he's asking a question. Do I go in? Go out? Whatever the question is, the high priest will consult the Urim and then tell him whether to go in or go out. Now this is a strange thing. You know, people say, oh, that sounds like witchcraft to me. Well, you know, witchcraft or any other ungodly thing is really just a perverted part of what God had in mind. We look at witchcraft and we throw it, oh, that's terrible, that's terrible. And it is.
Right.
But it's based on what God does in the heavenlies. How do we know? Because the only thing Satan knows is what he saw in heaven. Think about that one. Yes.
What was the scripture again? Numbers what? 27?
That was Numbers chapter 27, verse 21. All right. So David has been sent out to find the Amalekites. And they didn't know where they went. I'm sure they were following the trade route, you know, kind of the best way through the mountains. And they came to this brook. It's called the brook Bezor. And at this time of the year, evidently the brook was full of water. Certain times of the year it's dry. But notice this time, there was 200 men that couldn't cross the brook. And it's easy to criticize them, but remember, they had just walked for 3 days solid, got home, spent all their energy crying, then walked another 10 miles or better to the brook Bezor. Now, not everybody is in tip-top physical shape. I don't care if you take a whole football team. They're not all going to perform the same way. No. You take a whole track team, you take a whole, and they're not all going to perform to the same level. They all don't have the same stamina. No matter how good they are, they're going to tire at different rates. And so there was 200 men who weren't even strong enough to cross the river. Why would you take them on a campaign to defeat the enemy if they can't even stand up to cross the river? They're worn out. Is it their fault? Yeah, they didn't eat enough bananas or something. I don't know. No, it's not really their fault. That's just the way it was. I'm sure if they had known months in advance that this was going to happen, they could have got in shape, but they didn't. All right. Also, as is always the case with God, He wants the minimum number of people required to perform the task. Think about Gideon. He had thousands at his command, and when he got through, he only had 300 to take on 100,000 enemy. Oh, wait a minute now, you're getting a little carried away here, God, you know. But Gideon never questioned God, and God brought the complete victory using him. David did all the damage he did with only 600 men. So God doesn't need a lot of numbers. All right, so, verse 11. Then they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David, and they gave him bread, and he ate, and they let him drink water. And they gave him a piece of cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. So when he had eaten, his strength came back to him, for he had eaten no bread, nor drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. Then David said to him, "To whom do you belong? And where are you from?" And he said, "I am a young man from Egypt, servant of an Amalekite, and my master left me behind because 3 days ago I fell sick. We made an invasion of the southern area of the Cherethites in the territory which belongs to Judah, and of the southern area of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire." Oh. And David said to him, "Can you take me down to this troop?" So he said, "Swear to me by God that you will neither kill me nor deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this troop." So here we have they cross the river, and they're on the other side of this river, and they find this guy laying out in the field. Now, it's kind of interesting to me. They're hurrying because they've got to catch up to the Amalekites. And yet they stop and go out into a field, find a guy laying out there who is obviously a servant, who's laying out in this field. Why would they do that? Why would an army take the time to go check on a servant? Huh. Strange, isn't it? They brought the man to David. David questioned him. Who are you? Where are you from? And the man said, nothing, because he was unable to. He hadn't eaten or drinking any water in 3 days. Now that isn't around here, where it's 60 degrees. It's humid, it's very dry, and it's very warm over there. Even when the rivers are flowing, it still gets very hot. That's a desert down there where he was. Can you imagine not eating or having anything to drink for 3 days? So they gave him some bread. They gave him some water. They gave him a fig cake. And they gave him grapes. They gave him bread to strain, for the substance, water for the thirst, and the grapes and the figs because they're high in sugar content. They give you energy. So they popped up, and he was alert. So David asked him, and the thing here that I want you to see is before he knew who the man was, he showed mercy to him. He reached out to the stranger, even though it impeded what they were doing. It interfered with their plans. Yet they still reached out to the stranger. They still showed love to the stranger. Here was somebody who needed food, he needed water, he needed strengthening, and they reached out to this man. Isn't that something Jesus said something about? If I remember sometime in there, he said something about this real love. You see, David not only was making Jehovah his Elohim, but he was also feeling the heart of Jehovah, which is love. For God so loved. And so he reached out to this man. And after David questioned him, he found out he was an Egyptian, and he a servant of one of the Amalekites that had captured their families and burned their house to the ground. And I'm sure some of those 600 men had their swords already coming out of the sheaths. They were pieces because it said, we burned this. He was involved. That means he may very well have been a conscripted servant soldier, which is what they would do with some of the younger men. They would actually make them soldiers in their armies. And they were probably getting ready to whack him to pieces. But not David. Now we learned something here. He said it had been 3 days. 3 days earlier, he'd fallen ill. And now 3 days means one whole night and at least partial of the other 2 days. So they could have left it maybe 6 o'clock on one night, and it would have been maybe 10 in the morning when they crossed the brook and found the young man. We don't know. But that would count 3 days the way the Jews counted time. But the thing that strikes me here is, number one, the brutality of the Amalekites. They have a servant, probably a soldier, he gets sick, and so they just throw him out in the field and say, yeah, and walk off. No water, no food, nothing. Take care of yourself. And probably just as an end statement, his master probably said, well, if you get over this, we're going to be down at the crossroads, down there. We're going to encamp there for a few days. So, if you make it, come down to us. That was their thinking. What a difference, huh? But this does tell us that how far ahead the Amalekites were. If you figure the 3 days, they had a 3-day head start. Whether that actually meant, a night and a day and a night, we don't know. But however they figured it, David then knew how far ahead they were. Now, the Cherethites, these were actually the Philistines. And a little bit of history, we had the Philistines who came from Philistia. We had these Cherethites who were from the Isle of Crete, they're pretty sure. And they kind of merged in Canaan along the coastal areas and intermarried, and so you still had some Cherethites that were identified as this group from Crete, and you had the Philistines who identified more with Philistia. But they were all considered Philistines. They were all in the same alliance and the same thing. And so what the young man tells David is that we not only burned down Ziklag, but we also attacked and raided the Philistines. No wonder they were getting out of town. It wasn't that they were allies with the Philistines. They were raiding the Philistines on equal time with those in Israel. Anything in southern Judah, they were raiding. All right, verse 16. And when he had brought him down, there. And David said to him, "Can you take?" Verse 13. "Can you take me down to this troop?" So he says, "Swear by me, by God, that you will neither deliver me, nor neither kill me nor deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this troop." Now the man wanted David to swear by Elohim. So before, I saw one commentary, he said, "Oh, this man understood about Jehovah," and he goes on and on and on. He didn't say Jehovah, he said Elohim. Swear by Elohim. That would be any divine person, any angel, anything considered supernatural was an Elohim. Swear by Elohim. What Elohim? But to David, that took a personal meaning. To everybody else, it may have just been anybody. So the man's master probably told him where he was going. But the man did not want to go back to his master. If somebody had left me out in the middle of a field in high temperature with water and no bread, and I'm sick, I don't think I'd want to go back to him either. All right, now we go to verse 16. And when he had brought him down, there they were, spread out over all the land, eating and drinking and dancing, because all of the great spoil which they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. Then David attacked them from twilight until the evening of the next day. Not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. Tickles me. So David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away. And David rescued his 2 wives, and nothing of theirs was lacking, either small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything which they had taken from them. David recovered all. Then David took all the flocks and herds that had driven before those other livestock and said, "This is David's spoil." All right. So this young man led them to where they were encamped. Now, evidently the Amalekites had assumed that David and his men were going to go into battle against Israel. Their spies knew they were all up at Aphek, putting the army together, or they had moved down to the valley of Jezreel, where they were going to battle Saul and his troops. So we don't know exactly where this falls in this time frame. But it would be someplace right at the end of the encampment of Aphek and the move to the battlefield to take on Israel. But they knew they were all at least 3 to 4 days away. So we're safe. There is nobody else here. that's going to challenge us. There's no army around, there's no militia, there is nobody. Remember, it was only David that worked in this area, that kept all of the raiders away when he went to Nabal, with the sheep and all. It was David and his men. There wasn't anybody else. They were the private guards, if you might say, or police force that was hired to take care of that region. And they were all gone. So what these guys did is, instead of forming an encampment, you remember we talked about Saul, how he had his encampment with the wagons on the outside. It's like circling the wagons. You had your carts and all of your servants on the outside, and then your soldiers, and then right in the middle is where Saul was. Him and his leaders were in the middle. So they had this defensive structure. So if somebody attacked, well, these guys didn't do any of that. It says here they were spread out all over the flat country. They were just all over. And it must have been in the evening, because they were eating and dancing and drinking and having a good time, and probably had bonfires out, and everything looked so great, and they were just having a big time celebrating what had happened. Now, what we don't know here, and a lot of the commentaries have talked about this, David's 400 men had to be exhausted too. David and his men. So probably, since it's not mentioned here, it's quite possible that David waited a day before he attacked. They weren't going anywhere. They were busy with their celebrations, which would last days, their feasts and stuff, So they probably found a nice quiet place and rested for a day or so before they attacked. Otherwise, taking worn out men into a battle is not a good idea, no matter how many fruitcakes they eat. All right. Now, they hadn't even evidently posted sentries. So when David got ready to attack, they just went out into the fields and started in. And I don't know how David planned it, but if his mighty men could take on 1,000 men, and let's say there was 20,000 in this party, he may have had, well, okay, you get that 1,000, you got that 1,000, you take on that, you take on this, and then, I don't know how he did it. I kind of assume that they went out piecemeal into that, and just all of a sudden pulled out their swords and started in, and probably killed a bunch of them before they even figured out that they needed to draw weapons, especially if they'd been drinking pretty good,
Yeah.
But they fought them, they attacked in the evening, they fought all night and all the next day. Now that tells me it must have been a pretty good sized force. 600 mighty men should have been able to clear out a force of a couple of thousand guys in just a couple of hours, Each one kills 2 or 3.
But that wasn't 600, it was only 4.
400, right. Sorry about that. They still should have been able to do it in a couple of 3 hours, but it took them all night and all the next day.
It's hard to see in the dark.
Was it?
It's hard to see in the dark.
Yeah, it's hard to see in the dark. Yes, it is. Even with bonfires going, it's hard to know who's who in the zoo.
Yep.
Especially since they probably didn't wear armor or anything, Anyway, we don't know how big it was. However, we do know that 400 of them got away on camels. That meant there must have been 400 camels, right? I wonder how many camels were left behind. Think
Pretty
about it.
big herd then.
Yeah, they had a bunch of camels, and of course they used the camels to transport all of the stuff that they stole. You see pictures of the camel caravans. They still use them today. They're still used over there in the desert areas. And if you had a string of, say you had 1,000 camels, look how much you could carry on that. Now, they must have kept a lot of camels because they recovered everything. All they took from Ziklag and all they took from all of these other places, all of that spoil, they got it all back. Now, how did they get it home if they didn't have camels?
Right.
Yeah.
Them poor little donkeys ain't gonna carry that much. Even, I'm not gonna go with that game. Well, anyway. All right. They killed every member of the Amalekite raiding party. There was nobody left except those 400. And they were probably the servants that took care of the camels.
Yeah.
because they would have been there. They would have been around the camels. They wouldn't have been in the camps with the rest of them. So when they saw what was happening, they're not stupid. Up on the camel we go. Oh, let's go. Home. All right, and after all the goods, the people and the goods were accounted for that were taken from Ziklag. It appears that from the way it's written, we don't see it in the text here, but from the way it's written, that the men, David's men, and three commentaries I looked at all agreed on this, that it was David's men who decreed that David should get all the animals that were not taken. In other words, the Amalekites came into Judah with strings of animals that they were pushing. They were herdsmen, I mean they were nomads, and so they had their flocks and all that. That all belonged to David. That was his spoil. The soldiers would take all of the other stuff, whatever they got off of the soldiers, that they killed, whatever, and that would be theirs. And that would be divided amongst the troops. This was something that was done in those days anyway. And we'll see the Philistines doing the same thing here in the next chapter. So, David gets all these animals and whatever. Verse 21. Now David came to the 200 men who had been so worried that they could not follow David, whom they also had made to stay at the brook Bezor. So they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near the people, he greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless men, what? Then all the wicked and worthless men of those who went with David answered and said, because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except for every man's wife and children, that they may lead them away and depart.
Sorry.
But David said, my brethren, you shall not do so with what the Lord has given us, who has preserved us and delivered into our hand the troop that came against us. For who will heed you in this matter? But as his part is who goes down to the battle, so shall his part be who stays by the supplies. They shall share alike. So it was from that day forward, he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day. All right, so here's David with his 400 men, a string of camels with all of the stuff on it, all the sheep, all the goats, all the oxen, and his 400 men, and they come back to the brook Bezor. And when the men who were left behind, the 200, saw them coming, they ran out to greet them. They were looking for their wives and their kids. That's what they were doing. But notice something. It says, David greeted them. That word greeted means he had a comforting or a word to them that was encouraging, I guess would be one way to put it. In other words, he didn't come out there and he didn't jump on them. Mm-hmm. And so, in spite of your laziness, look what we have. He didn't approach it that way. He had a kind word for them. But this is a part that's interesting. It's the wicked and worthless. They had just killed all of these Amalekites. And they're called worthless.
Is that because they didn't go with him?
Does that tell us something?
Was that because they didn't go with him?
No, this is the part of the 400. These are the guys that went with David, and they came back, and they said, we're not gonna give these 200 men anything because they didn't go to battle.
I know, I understood that. I was saying, they were saying that to the 200 men that were,
Oh, yeah, they were saying it to them. But the thing is, these were the mighty men who had just defeated all of these Amalekites. And I'm sure it took 400 of them to overcome this huge force that was out there. And yet, the Bible says they were evil and worthless.
Wow.
You see, God judges us not by what we do, but by what we are.
That's true.
These men were wicked and worthless. Because David could just as well have gone through all the cities and towns in the area with a list and says, anybody who's a valiant man, come with me, sign here and I'll pay you so much a week to be a soldier.
Yeah.
And they could have gone out on the battlefield and they could have fought well and won their share of the booty.
Right.
But that's not what God is looking for. And we sometimes equate our spirituality to what we do. Oh my God, I come to church every Sunday, I'm an usher, I'm a this, I'm a greeter, I fix the building, I paint, I'm a singer, I even teach some, so I am really important. I must be great in your eyes. But what does it say in the New Testament? There's going to be some that stand before him. He's going to say, you're over here on the left with the goats. And they're going to say, but God, look at everything I've done. I even cast out demons in your name. I healed the sick. I did all of that. And he's going to say, I don't even know you. I don't know you. I never want to be put in that position of God saying, I don't know you. It's not based on our actions. It's not based on our spiritual gifts. It's not based on how often we read or how much we read or even how much we pray. I know some folks pray a lot more than I do.
Yep, I was so too.
They pull out their beads and they start through their beads. Vain repetitions. See, God wants our heart.
Right.
God wants our heart.
Now, I don't understand this verse 22, that all the wicked, worthless men of those who went with David. These are the men who fought, right?
That's what I'm saying, yes. They fought. They were brave. They were valiant. They did everything David asked. And then some.
Right.
They fought the battle for God in the end. But their heart was not where it needed to be with God. He doesn't look at the outward. He looks at the heart. The heart was the heart of David. Oh, you guys couldn't go to the battle. I can see David saying, you guys, man, I got to tell you, you missed it. You missed it, man. We went out there and there they were laid out and man, we just went through there. God helped us and you guys really missed it. It's too bad you couldn't have gone. See, that would have been David's approach, rather than give them their wives, give them whatever has been stolen so they can get out and depart. In other words, leave us.
Right.
Throw them out. They didn't do what I did. And that's what it really comes down to. 9 times out of 10. Why should they get the same as I get? They didn't do what I did. You remember Jesus told the parable of the guys going to work in the field? The guy hired some in the morning, and he hired some in the midday, and he hired some later, and he finally hired one, only went out and worked a couple hours, but they all got the same pay. And some of them were really mad about that.
Yeah.
What difference does it make? How much you work? You all got paid, didn't you? So quit complaining. You know?
Yeah.
But that's the lesson that we need to learn here. They were called wicked and worthless. What? Oh. All right, something else I want to point out. God uses all kinds of people to fulfill His will. You would think God would have taken these 400 out earlier, however many out of that, however many there were. Maybe there was 10, maybe there was 100, I don't know. Maybe God would have called those out if He only uses perfect people. Nobody is perfect all the time, and few are perfect even some of the time. Right? So it's easy for us to judge these guys. Of course, we're not. The Bible says they were wicked. But evidently they got straightened around, because later when David was king, we see some of these same men. He keeps his 600 with him, and they all seem to have changed after David became king. But the point here is God uses everybody. And they may not do the same as we do. They may not act the way we act. They may not think the way we think. They may not have the same skills that we have. But God uses them. And so we need to understand, He doesn't choose by our standards. He chooses by His standards. All right, notice also that this is, as far as we can tell, the first time that David exercises the authority given him by God. He stands, no, guys, sorry, that's not going to happen. What right do we have to say how the spoils, who were given to us by God, should be distributed? Do we have that right? And he says nobody, and I'm paraphrasing, nobody in his right mind would agree with you that we have that. It's God's. He's the one who gave it to us.
Right.
So what right do we have to decide how we should disperse it? You guys, who are you anyway? You're just 20, 50, 100, whatever it was. Schmucks. I don't know if he even reminded them, but you remember when the 600 came together, who were they? They were robbers, they were thieves, they were outcasts, they were paupers, they were all kinds of people. None of them very good. And we also should understand that maybe it took some of them longer to come around to where they should have been, considering where they started. It wasn't the men's place to decide. The right, that right belonged to God. Now, unless they wanted to go to the Urim and have God specifically say how much to give to everybody, which would not be practical probably, it went to the next in command. David was the recognized leader by God. He had anointed him to be the leader.
Right.
As the leader, it fell to him to make that decision. Sometimes we don't like that concept, but that's the way it is, and that's the way it should be in the church. It should be that way in the country. The man appointed by God should make the decisions, in my opinion. All right. All right, David made an interesting statement. He said that since these men had stayed behind and provided a valuable service by watching the supplies, so evidently they left supplies that they didn't need behind when they found out how close, they were. Why shouldn't they get the same reward? They would have been in trouble if somebody had stolen all of their supplies, so they'd be in battle again. So it was just as important for them to be there. And the concept then that David made a statute or a law that lasted even through the time of the Romans, that it was the soldier's right to be paid and to get his share of the loot or the spoil, no matter what job he was performing. And that holds even till today. If a unit of the army or someplace gains a great victory, They don't go by and say, well, this guy, these people get more praise because they were the guys that stormed the hill. And these guys don't get as much praise because they merely sat back here and fired the cannons, that kind of thing. No, they all get equal praise because it took all of them. Even the ones that was carrying ammunition up may have never fired a shot, but they were supplying logistics and stuff. Without them, you're not going to win. And this was what David was instigating. This is the first time we see this, as far as we know, in history, was right here. All right. Verses 26. Now when David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah, to his friends, saying, here is a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. Now I'm not going to go through all of these, but on your map in the back, if you can read it, because my stupid printer is giving me fits. I got to get all the ink cartridges. I have put on here where all of those places are. You'll see them in red. Down at the bottom, there's Jader, Ramoth, Horman, Oreo. There's the brook, Bezor, all of that. So you can look and see where David sent these presents. These were probably areas that the raiders had taken spoils, flocks, whatever. David returned them to them. He calls them his friends. Many of these he probably got to know when he was in the area of in Gedi. All right, let's go to verse 31. This will go over here in just a minute. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines, and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. Then the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, Saul's sons. And the battle became fierce against Saul. The archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men died together that same day. But while David was down dealing with the Amalekites, the battle ensued, and it must have been a very fast battle. And you remember what Samuel told Saul. He said, this day the kingdom is torn from you, and in one day you and your sons and the armies of Israel will die. One day, in the same day. So the prophecy of Samuel comes to pass here. Now notice it says they were on the mountain of Gilboa, and I have a couple of pictures in here. I don't know how well they are. Yeah. I think you can see this first one, and it says shutter stuck across it. That's from the internet. So don't publish it without you pay this guy. But we can use it, it's legal to use it here. This gives you a look at the end of Mount Gilboa. All right, it extends back from what you're seeing here. All right, so that mountain right there is Mount Gilboa, taken from this location. If you turn over to the next page, this old photograph was taken in 1915, and it shows the side of Mount Gilboa. So you can kind of get an idea. This is the Valley of Jezreel right here. This will be where the Battle of Armageddon will be fought, in this valley. This is what it looked like in 1915. You notice not many crops, there's not much there, no city, no nothing. It was interesting, I was looking up Mount Gilboa, and there was an article, current article, had a picture of Mount Gilboa, and it says, this is the first man-made forest in Israel. And it's just covering the whole, up the side of Gilboa, as it's starting to take root. And it's interesting that David, well, we'll see that in 2 Samuel, but David places a curse on Mount Gilboa. He said the rain won't fall there and nothing will grow there. And even in this article from Jerusalem Today, it mentions David's prophecy. And it says, today, the wildflowers have returned and the forest is now returning. And in the prophecy of the coming of the Messiah, it mentions that Israel, and specifically these portions, are going to bloom with flowers, and they're going to be, again, a beautiful country of milk and honey. We're seeing that happen now. That should wake anybody up. It's time to get ready. All right. Now, Gilboa was a good place to retreat, because once you got to the top, it was easy to defend. So if you could get your army up there,
You can see all down.
yeah, and they start up, you can throw rocks at them, I mean, you can do all kinds of things to keep that army down and away from you. But they never made it to the top. As they started up, they were caught by the Philistines, and Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, that's how you pronounce that, were all killed. Now people say, why was Jonathan killed? This was David's friend. This was somebody who befriended David in the face of anything. God, why did you let Jonathan die? And David probably questioned God the same way.
Yeah.
But I read a really interesting little short article. And he said, if Jonathan had lived, the first thing he would have done is given David the crown. Because he already said, you're the king.
Yeah.
First thing he would have done is given David the crown.
Right.
What would that have done? It took it out of God's hand. David had no right to the throne. He had no right to anything. He was a little shepherd boy. God said he'd take it away from Saul and his family and he would give it to David, not Jonathan. Jonathan would have been credited with giving David. He said, Jonathan abdicated the throne and gave it to David.
Yeah.
And secondly, it would have aroused in Israel a debate. Every time David did a little something that they didn't agree with, I wonder if we should take that crown away from David. He's not the rightful heir anyway, and give it to Jonathan. So you had those two things. So in God's plan, it was more perfect because it allowed David to rightfully take the throne as is given by God and not have that situation to deal with.
Right.
All right. Now, evidently, Saul fought bravely. Because after his two sons were dead, he's still fighting. And then somebody shoots an arrow. And he's mortally wounded. And so he looks at his armor bearer and he says, kill me. Run me through. So they won't get a hold of me. Because if they get a hold of me, they're going to torture me. They're going to desecrate my body. They're going to tear me up and cut me to pieces right here while I'm still alive. Kill me. The armor bearer was afraid and would not kill Saul. So Saul took a sword and killed himself. Then the armor bearer
Killed himself.
And we know the relationship between the king and the armor bearer from Saul's relationship with David. It was more than just a soldier relationship. They became very close. And so you can see that happening. And also the armor bearer would know that he would be responsible for the death of Saul because he didn't protect him. All right. Something that was Doeg, by the way, that was made armor bearer, but I don't think so. And that doesn't fit. All right. Verse 7. And when the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley, and those who were on the other side of the Jordan, saw that the men of Israel had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook the cities and fled, and the Philistines came and dwelt in them. So it happened the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they cut off his head, and stripped off his armor, and sent word throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim it in the temple of their idols, and among the people. Then they put his armor in the temple of the Ashtaroths, and they fastened his body on the wall of Beth-Shan. All right, so what we see here is that part of the army of Israel remained on the other side of the valley. And this would be a good move. So if they needed reinforcements, they could come. And also if Israel defeated the Philistines, then the other part of the army would rush from the other side behind them, and they could kill them, get them wrong, kill them, and box them in. And they evidently had some also on the other side of the Jordan to keep them from crossing the Jordan River. Same thing Gideon did, by the way. But when they looked and they saw Israel fleeing up the sides of Gilboa, when they looked at that mountain and they saw it suddenly come alive with thousands of Israeli troops running up that hill, they knew the battle had gone bad. And there was no use in trying to help. And they just took off. And they left. And the people of the cities, when they saw that, they left. They did not want to be under the Philistine rule, because they knew what the Philistines were going to do. And in the next morning, the Philistines immediately took control of the cities in that area along both sides of the Jezreel. Maybe even crossed Jordan over to those cities. But the next morning they went out to the battlefield to get all of the spoils. Get jewelry, swords, armor, whatever they could find. And they found the bodies of Jonathan, Abinadab, and Saul. And so what they immediately did was take and cut Saul's head off. After all, isn't that what David did to Goliath?
Yep.
And then they took his head and they sent it on a circuit around the Philistines. They probably put him on the fastest horse they had, because they had horses. And they raced around, and they went to Ekron and Gath and all the main cities, displaying the head of Saul.
Wow.
And they took his armor and they put it in the temple of Ashtaroth. The most famous temple was a temple to Venus. It's called the Temple of Venus. And that was a temple to Ashtaroth. Ashtaroth was synonymous with Venus to the Philistines. Where am I here? And they hung the bodies. Oh, they took Saul's armor. And, well, first of all, they took the head of Saul and placed it in the temple of Dagon in the city of Ashdod. Then they took Saul's armor and placed it in the temple of Ashtaroth, which is Venus. And then they hung the bodies of Saul and his 3 sons on the wall outside the temple that stood in the city of Beth-Shan. Now this was their way of honoring their gods. These were trophies. Not unlike Israel. What did they do with the armor and the sword of Goliath? They put it in the tabernacle. And that's where David found it, you remember. So this was common practice. Not to take the head necessarily, but again, the head of Goliath went to Jerusalem. Now the one that's interesting is Beth-Shan. There is no gods associated here with Beth-Shan. And so nobody knew what this was all about. The wall here was a city wall that was right outside the temple, this temple. Well, I was reading and they have uncovered Beth-Shan and how many temples were on top of it. And it's really interesting. It's quite an interesting place. And it was one of the big mysteries of Israeli archaeology. They actually uncovered it in 1922 and took all the stuff over here to, I believe it's Philadelphia, to the museum in Philadelphia, and nobody has had time to look at it until now.
Wow.
So they've gone through it, and what they have found is this was a cult of snake worshipers. And there were several temples on top of each other, so this lasted for hundreds of years. This was a center for snake worshipers, which is kind of interesting. But that's where they hung them. All right. Verse 11. Now when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and traveled all night, and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Beth-Shan. And they came to Jabesh and burned them there. Then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Gabesh, and fasted 7 days. These were the men, you'll remember the story of Gabesh Gilead, how the enemy, I believe it was the Mennonite, not Mennonites, they weren't there then, Midianites, I believe it was. You remember they came to the city and they gave the inhabitants an ultimatum. You either come out and, or we're going to lay siege to the city and kill them all. So the leaders came out and said, okay, just, we will worship you. And they said, okay, you worship us on the condition that we put all of your right eyes out. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when Saul heard it, the Bible says that the Spirit of the Lord came on him. This was his first act as king. It says the Spirit came on him and he became angry, and he called for all the armies, and they crossed the Jordan River and they wiped the Midianites out. Saul's first act as king, big act. And because of that, the city held him in very high esteem. No matter what he did, it didn't matter. He was their savior. And when they heard what had happened, they traveled all night. It was about 10 miles to Bethshan. Took the bodies down and brought the 3 bodies home and then burned them. Why would they burn them?
Yeah.
In those days, you put them in tombs, and the bodies, the bones were... Well, if they had put them in a tomb, like they normally would, Philistines could have found them.
Come back.
Yeah.
And then it would have, and they just would have been a big fiasco. By burning them, there was nothing to distinguish them from anybody else.
Right.
And then they buried them under the tamarisk tree, which is an oak tree. Evidently it was one that was well known in the area, but it was an unmarked grave. No way could the enemies of Israel ever find the first king and say, look what we have done. All right. Any questions? We're done.